What if history's most hated man was actually doing the will of God? What if the kiss that betrayed Jesus wasn't a betrayal at all, but a necessary act of obedience? We know the story. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, a kiss in the dead of night. Soldiers, chains, the beginning of the crucifixion. It's the textbook definition of betrayal, the kind that echoes through generations. Judas has become the symbol of disloyalty, his name a curse, his fate a warning. But what if it's not that simple? What if this wasn't just a story of silver and sin, but of sacrifice? What if Judas wasn't a coward, but the bravest of them all? To even ask this question feels like heresy. But some ancient texts, ones that were hidden, silenced, even banned, tell a radically different story. They suggest that Judas may not have been the traitor we've been taught to despise, but the one disciple who truly understood what needed to happen. And that raises the uncomfortable question: if Judas didn't betray Jesus, then what exactly did he do? And more importantly, why? Let's go back to the dusty roads of Jerusalem, back to the Last Supper, back to a moment that would change the world forever. For nearly 2,000 years, Judas Iscariot has been Christianity's ultimate villain. In stained glass windows, medieval paintings, and Sunday sermons, he's the dark figure lurking in the corner, the traitor, the backstabber, the one who traded the Son of God for the price of a slave. 30 pieces of silver, that's all it took. According to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Judas was one of Jesus's closest companions, hand-picked, trusted. He traveled with Jesus, heard every teaching, witnessed every miracle. He saw water turn to wine, watched the blind regain sight, and stood beside the one he would eventually betray. The story most of us know begins in secret. Judas goes to the high priests. He offers to hand Jesus over when the time is right. They agree. And the price? 30 silver coins. Not gold, not land, just silver. Later, at the Last Supper, Jesus looks around at the 12 men he's lived with, bled with, and trusted. Then he says something that chills the room. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples are stunned. They protest, "Surely not I, Lord." And then Judas looks Jesus in the eye and says the same, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Jesus answers with a haunting certainty, "You have said so." Hours later, Judas leads the soldiers into the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying. The night is quiet, the air thick with tension. And then it happens. A kiss, that's the signal. The man I kiss is the one you seek. A kiss, a gesture of affection twisted into the ultimate betrayal. The soldiers arrest Jesus. The rest of the disciples scatter. The crucifixion begins, and Judas vanishes, his name forever marked as the traitor. Church tradition for centuries has held on to this view. Judas, the one who lost faith, the greedy disciple, the deceiver, the one who walked with God and still chose evil. But here's the thing, the story isn't over, because what Judas did next doesn't fit the mold of a villain. And maybe, just maybe, that's where everything starts to shift. Here's something that doesn't quite add up. Jesus wasn't surprised by Judas. He didn't seem caught off guard or heartbroken or even angry. In fact, from the very beginning of his ministry, he spoke in riddles that hinted at betrayal. He knew one of his own would turn against him, but instead of casting Judas out, he kept him close. Why? Think about it. Jesus had the power to read hearts. He knew the intentions of the Pharisees before they spoke. He knew Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And yet, knowing full well what Judas would do, he chose him anyway. He gave Judas a seat at the table. He washed Judas's feet. And then, in the final moments of the Last Supper, Jesus looked at him and said something cryptic and chilling. "What you are about to do quickly." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an attempt to stop him. It was almost permission. Like Judas was fulfilling a role in a story that had to unfold. A role that Jesus not only anticipated, but accepted, and maybe even needed. Here's where it gets strange. In the Gospels, Jesus often predicted his own death. He spoke of being handed over and crucified. He warned the disciples again and again, but they never truly understood. Judas, on the other hand, might have, which raises a wild possibility. What if Judas didn't act against Jesus? What if he acted for him? It sounds insane, blasphemous even. But this theory doesn't come from modern fiction. It comes from something much older, something long buried, a forbidden gospel that tells the story from Judas's point of view. Here's the question that's haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries. Did Judas have a choice? Was he truly free to walk away from that betrayal? Or was he just a pawn in a divine plan that had already been written? Because if you believe in prophecy, real biblical prophecy, then Judas's actions weren't spontaneous. They were foretold. In Psalm 41:9, a verse written centuries before Judas was born, the psalmist writes, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." And then there's Zechariah, who speaks of 30 pieces of silver being cast into the house of the Lord. A coincidence? Maybe. But the New Testament writers clearly saw it as more than that. They saw it as fulfillment. So, if it was all destined, can Judas really be blamed? This is where the philosophy gets messy. If God is all-knowing, if he sees the end from the beginning, then he already knew Judas would betray Jesus, which means Judas was never free. But if he was free, if he could have chosen otherwise, then what does that mean for God's plan? Because without Judas, there's no arrest, no trial, no cross, and without the cross, there's no resurrection, no salvation, no Christianity. Suddenly, Judas isn't just a side character. He's the hinge that turns the entire story. This is where morality starts to blur. We want a clean division, good versus evil, hero versus villain. But life, and especially the life of Judas, refuses to fit neatly into those boxes. Was he guilty or chosen? A traitor or a necessary sacrifice? It's a question that turns religion into a riddle. And depending on where you look, the answers get even stranger. Because in the sands of Egypt, a lost manuscript was found, one that flips the entire story upside down. In the late 1970s, deep in the Egyptian desert, a mysterious papyrus surfaced. It was old, ancient in fact, nearly 1,800 years old, fragile, decaying, and written in Coptic. For decades, it sat in a safe deposit box, misidentified and nearly lost to time. But when scholars finally examined it, their jaws dropped. It was called the Gospel of Judas, a text that had been banned by the early church. A gospel so radical, so subversive, that it was declared heresy and buried, literally. And its message? It doesn't paint Judas as the villain, it paints him as the only one who truly understood Jesus. According to this gospel, Jesus didn't ask Judas to betray him out of anger or punishment. He chose Judas, specifically, privately, because only Judas had the strength to carry out what none of the other disciples could. The gospel claims that Jesus told Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In other words, Jesus asked Judas to help him shed his earthly body so that his divine purpose could be fulfilled. Think about that. What if Judas wasn't betraying Jesus? He was obeying him? What if that kiss wasn't treachery, but a heartbreaking act of loyalty? According to this gospel, Judas wasn't acting in greed. He wasn't possessed by Satan. He was following orders, sacred orders. He carried the weight of the world's hatred to fulfill a divine request. Now, to be clear, this gospel isn't part of the Bible. It was rejected by early church leaders, possibly because it contradicted everything the official narrative was built on. It's part of a group of texts called the Gnostic Gospels, hidden teachings that were suppressed when the Bible was canonized. But whether you believe it's truth or fiction, one thing is certain. The Gospel of Judas forces us to question everything we think we know about the man we've called history's greatest traitor. It doesn't excuse his actions, it reframes them, and that might be even more dangerous. No matter how you interpret Judas's motives, greed, obedience, destiny, one thing is painfully clear: he couldn't live with what he had done. The Gospels tell us that after Jesus was arrested, something shifted in Judas. The silver that once seemed worth it now felt like a curse. The coins that had clinked with power now rang hollow with guilt. He tried to give them back. In the Gospel of Matthew, it says Judas went to the temple priests and confessed, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." But the priests coldly dismissed him. "What is that to us?" they said. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the silver on the temple floor and fled, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, heavier than any coin. And then he hanged himself. It's one of the most haunting endings in all of Scripture. The man who walked beside Jesus, the man who shared meals with the Son of God, the man who knew the teachings, the miracles, the message, died alone, in despair, in silence. And that's what makes this story so tragic. Not just the betrayal, but the regret. If Judas was purely evil, why feel remorse? Why return the silver? Why end his own life? Villains don't usually repent, but Judas did. And that raises the question, did he finally understand what he had done? Or did he believe he had failed in the mission Jesus gave him? Think of it like this. If Judas believed he was helping to fulfill a divine plan, then Jesus' arrest should have brought him a strange kind of peace, but instead, it broke him. So maybe he realized too late that the world would never know his side of the story, that he would forever be remembered as the betrayer, even if he saw himself as something else entirely, a necessary evil, a loyal friend, or perhaps the most tragic figure in all of history. Here's a truth most people don't want to talk about. Without Judas, there is no crucifixion. And without the crucifixion, there's no resurrection, which means no Christianity. It's a chilling thought, one that flips the entire narrative on its head. The betrayal of Jesus wasn't a side plot. It was the spark, the trigger, the one action that set the most important event in Christian theology into motion. The arrest, the trial, the cross, the empty tomb, all of it began with Judas. So what does that make him? Was he an instrument of evil or the first link in a divine chain of events? It's unsettling, but worth considering. Could Judas's betrayal have been a necessary part of God's plan? It's not just a question of theology, it's a philosophical paradox. Imagine a man born for a single purpose, to hand over his teacher, so the world could be saved. Imagine knowing your name will be hated for centuries, but doing it anyway. Imagine being the key to salvation, but the world calling you a traitor. It's the kind of contradiction that breaks your brain. Judas is both the cause of death and, in a strange, indirect way, the cause of life. Because according to Christian doctrine, Jesus had to die, not just to suffer, but to overcome death, to rise again, to prove something eternal, and someone had to make that death happen. Pontius Pilate signed the order. The Roman soldiers carried it out, but Judas lit the match. If we celebrate the resurrection, do we also secretly owe thanks to the betrayer? And if so, why has history only ever told one side of his story? Every story needs a villain. It's comforting, isn't it, to believe that evil has a face, that someone somewhere can be blamed. In the story of Jesus, Judas became that face. He's the cautionary tale, the example held up in sermons, in Sunday school, in sacred art. His name is synonymous with betrayal. His story is rarely told with compassion, only with disgust, and sometimes fear. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Maybe we needed Judas to be the villain, because the alternative is too painful to accept. If Judas wasn't evil, if he was chosen, then everything we thought we knew collapses. The boundaries between good and bad start to blur. We start asking questions that are far too dangerous for institutions built on clear answers. Questions like, can someone be both damned and divine? Is it possible to fulfill God's will and be hated for it? And perhaps the scariest question of all, have we misunderstood a man for 2,000 years simply because it was easier than facing the complexity of his role? It's easier to create a scapegoat than to wrestle with paradox. It's easier to paint Judas in black and white than to face the possibility that he lived and died in shades of gray. But if we dare to look deeper, to go beyond the Sunday school version, we find a legacy that is far more tragic, far more human, and maybe far more heroic. Because the story of Judas isn't just about betrayal. It's about faith, obedience, consequence, and the unbearable weight of being necessary but unforgiven. What if the most reviled man in the Bible wasn't evil? What if Judas was just a man caught between destiny and conscience, handed an impossible role in a divine drama no one else had the courage to play? What if he wasn't the betrayer, but the one who carried the burden so others wouldn't have to? History has a habit of simplifying people. Heroes wear halos, villains wear shadows, but the truth lives somewhere in between. Maybe Judas wasn't a monster. Maybe he was a mirror reflecting the hardest parts of ourselves. The fear, the doubt, the choices we wish we never had to make. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't defend himself. He didn't write his own gospel. Others told his story, and they told it in a way that made sense to the world they were building. But maybe, just maybe, Judas deserves more than silence and silver coins. Maybe he deserves our curiosity, our discomfort, our pause. Because if the road to salvation began with a kiss in the dark, then the question isn't, why did Judas betray Jesus? It's, why did Jesus choose Judas, knowing everything? And maybe, just maybe, that's the real mystery.